Someday I'm going to get around to the bottomless pit of RCA communications equipment in my basement, but I'm still working on laboratory stuff here. This might be the end of the run of the laboratory stuff, but I saved the best for last. Since we're on the subject of television camera tubes, this is a iconoscope tube from the Camden laboratory, made in 1932 by my grandfather, Les Flory. This is pretty early in the television camera tube line. I've got a piece of an earlier tube, but this is a very early one. This is about the time when they revolutionized resolution by getting tiny little spherical blobs of silver to condense on a piece of mica and get a surface where there were distinct chargeable units at a very high resolution. And you're all invited to come take a look at it. I don't know what else I can say. I'll answer questions. I'll just say, don't reach for it with an arm that you intend to use for anything else.
Hey, Rob, was that strictly experimental, or was there a camera built around that, too?
Well, they built cameras around them to test the tubes. They had a lot of interesting problems with microphonics and stuff in the early days. But I believe this one was one of the ones that worked. But all those cameras were just to test the tubes, and they didn't produce anything commercially until 7 years later or so.
What's the number on that tube? Do you have a number?
There's a handwritten number 100 on there, and if you look at the Sarnoff Library website, there's a publication which is a review of iconoscope development from some date in 1930 to some date in 1932, I think, that describes some of these numbered prototype tubes and how they were built and how they performed. This one's not mentioned in the publication, but you can see that progression of the numbers.
This is a prototype, though.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I always think a prototype is something before you go to manufacturing. So this is like a lab. It's a demonstration of principle if you're still trying to work on the pixelation problem.
Hey, Rob, the later production, were they larger than that?
Yeah, just take a look down there. The 1850, which was the broadcast one, the round portion here is, I think, about 8 inches in diameter. The 1846, which is the flying bomb camera tube, was, I think, about 6 inches in diameter. They tried some with the gun in line with the picture. This is one of the offset ones. They each had their problems, but they really went with the offset ones because the ones where the gun was in line with the mosaic, the gun shaded the mosaic too much, and it caused too many defects in the picture.
How did he come to take it home with him, Rob?
He built it, Sarnovium, they call it. Some of the stuff went through a dumpster first on the way home, but it's one of his pieces of old junk, as he called it.
If the camera has less let's say surface area than the viewing tube, does that create a resolution issue? In other words, would your picture on your TV be less sharp than the picture that you're recording, or is that not an issue?
I don't think that's really an issue, because your mosaic is a different animal than your kinescope, which is your viewing
Back, yeah.
tube.
Not the same thing.
But you might point out that this is the
They project it
beginning.
into the lens, so that compensates for
Compensates.
You might point out that this marks the beginning of modern television cameras, electronic imagers that has nothing to do with Philo Farnsworth. The big point here being that this was a much harder imager tube to invent or reduce to practice because it stored each pixel between scans. You have 30 scans a second. You've got all that space in that second where light is falling on the imager. And in this case, the pixels, the sensitive, photosensitive elements, are storing that light and developing a much broader contrast or dynamic range. And that's what Zworykin had been trying to do since 1923. And it had nothing to do with Farnsworth, none of whose tubes had any storage whatsoever. They worked on a completely different principle. And so when you hear that Zworykin went to Farnsworth's lab and obviously stole something that made his technology work, the point is there was nothing at Farnsworth's labs to steal. And this was the result of work by Rob's father, Sanford Essig, Zworykin, Harley Iams. It was a whole team of people working together in Camden.
The year before this tube, they did build a Farnsworth-type image dissector. I mean, people do that kind of stuff. You try other people's stuff and see how it works. And they, they made pictures with it, but Zworykin, unlike Farnsworth, was able to do the math and calculate that there was a fundamental limitation in that, just according to the by the time you got down into really low light levels, you were getting into the range where one light level was one electron different than the next level, and you were never going to be able to improve it beyond that. And Zworykin, being a trained physicist, was able to make those kind of calculations. Farnsworth wasn't quite as aware of that limitation. He tried to work past that as sort of a desperate way of saving his tube. But also the year before this, they were making iconoscopes where each individual pixel was a little silver rivet in a honeycomb. And I have one of these mosaics. So somebody had to assemble, some poor student engineer, a tiny little rivet with a tiny little piece of glass around it, and then stick it in this honeycomb structure, which I think had maybe 10 pixels per, or 10, somewhere between 10 and 20 pixels per inch. So you were never really going to get, in a small thing like this, you were never going to get very many lines of resolution. But they did learn about how to scan the mosaic and about the storage principle, which, as Alex was saying, the mosaic is gathering light all the time, and what happens is these are like little photoelectric cells. They charge up as the light comes in, and then the beam comes around and discharges it, and it's the current of that discharge beam that makes the readable signal. And but there was sort of a serendipitous event where somebody overcooked the mosaic, and all the silver broke into these little drops, and that was like the aha moment. Before that, they were trying to cut a continuous silver surface with a no, it was like with a mechanical engraving tool, but it was still a very tedious process to try to cut it into little squares with a whole lot of pixels per inch. And again, just as tedious as the rivet thing, but they were able to get finer with that.
Is that in working condition?
No.
Let's light it up.
Yeah. Maybe we can fix it.